Hello. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I have audiences all around me. Thank you for coming out on another very steamy evening, but we're lucky to be in probably the coolest room in the whole building, those of you who know this building. I'm Kara Carmack, the head of exhibitions and public programs here at the New York Studio School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion in honor of our current exhibition, Eyal Danieli, A Man of Parts. We're joined this evening by the curator of the exhibition, Robert Storr, art critic and historian Michael Brenson, artist and writer Alexi and artist Elizabeth Hazan. Unfortunately, Elena Sisto is unable to be with us tonight. Following the discussion, we'll open the floor to questions. For those of you in the room, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you. We are live streaming, so I'd love it if our online audience could hear your question. For those of you on Zoom, please type your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I'd like to remind you all to please silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already. And finally, I wish to extend a very special thanks to Amanda Guest for her tireless work behind the scenes the past few months, and also for organizing tonight's event. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
So we good? This is on? Okay. Thanks for coming. I mean, it's amazing. And, at the end of June on a hot day to see you all, I'm grateful and thank you. It's an odd setting, right? With this strange decor, like intense decor, like you're right in the middle of it. And it feels to me up here like we're on a boat and like we're all on a ship together and going, some kind of journey that's defined by Eyal, I don't know, but anyway, we're going somewhere. So I wanted to give a special thanks to the studio school. Are we still on? Okay. For doing this. Eyal went here. He was born in the States. He went to Israel. He came back here in his early 20s. When he came back, he went to the studio school like, other people, Ezra Cohen, Falun Bui. I'm sure there are people from other lands as well. And the studio school became, home for him. And it really was a foothold for him in the city and in this country. And he talked about how foundational it was. He said it gave him the foundational tools with which to sustain his practice. So it was a very important place for him to be in a very dynamic and very contested moment in the school. So for this school where he went, he was also a custodian here, to then, after his sudden and shocking death, to make it possible to do a memorial here, and then beyond the memorial to do an exhibition curated by Rob Storr. I think it's amazing, and just feel a tremendous amount of gratitude toward this place. The whole notion of institutional memory is such a conflicted one and a difficult one, but sometimes it works easily, and it works when it works smoothly like this, and an institution really can support as respectfully someone who came out of its history the way Eyal did. It's wonderful. So thank you to the school for doing this. Okay, so we're here to talk about Eyal's work. The structure of the panel is familiar. Each of us is going to put some ideas on the table, and then we'll go from there and talk among ourselves and then open it up to you all. And we don't know where it's going to go, and we're looking forward to finding out ourselves. All the other panelists, including Elena, who Kara mentioned, unfortunately can't be here, are painters. So maybe I'm an honorary, painter for today. I hope so. We all four of us knew Eyal to varying degrees, and we all have a connection to the studio school, also a very different kind of connection. So briefly with the introduction, Elizabeth Hazan was a student here. Under the Sun, her first show at Hesse Flat Tow took place earlier this year, and she's the founder and director of the wonderful platform Project Space in Brooklyn. Alexi participated in the studio school's evening lecture series, and he's done crits here, including quite recently. He's a writer, a very good critic, as well as a painter. his most recent show at DC Moore Gallery, Thinking in Threes, closed earlier this month. He's a senior critic at the New York Academy. And Rob Storr probably needs no introduction to you. He's really one of the indispensable figures in the New York art world over the last 40 years. With Jackie Bruckner, he ran the studio school for a year, and he ran the school when Eyal was a student, right? I think he actually had Eyal in a class. 5 years later, he was a curator at MoMA, where he changed the idea of what a modern contemporary curator at that institution could be. Then he became dean of the art school, and so we're defining him here primarily as a recovering curator, professor, and art critic. So just for myself to say a couple of words about Eyal, I'm interested in the notion of obscenity in this work, and obscenity in the work, and obscenity in the world that we live in, and a world of images, and how we experience that, and how it manifests itself through his imagery that Rob has made available to us through the process. I was thinking of that one Fagin image back there, the largest image of Fagin. I'm sorry, people in the front can't see it, but Fagin, the stereotypical Jewish figure in Dickens' Oliver Twist, is sort of facing kind of an Arab woman in a hijab. But she's an ambiguous figure, very Guston-like, and Eyal referred to Guston as his eldest, so he had elders, and then he had Guston, who had a different category. And then you have the figure. You've got the saluting arm on the top, which is flattened out a little bit, and then there are two figures like in a kind of benedictory gesture. So it's to make a point, if you look at the image, of the instability of Eyal's images, and the sense that there is a kind of threshold of legibility here, that he's always working on that threshold in one direction or another direction, and he can move toward abstraction, then he can move toward figuration, but it's never actually completely clear what the images are, because the images could also become something else. And then that saluting figure with the benedictory gesture, there's a kind of sardonic humor that Rob refers to, we said black gallows humor in the work, and I'm interested in the point where that humor, you look at it and then you notice it, and then it kind of becomes funny, and then something catches in your throat, and it becomes something else, and then it becomes difficult to actually talk about it and to find words for it. And thinking about this kind of backdrop here, and just thinking about this turning in the work, where he worked with a series, and then he worked with something over and over again, and then something becomes something else, and then it becomes something else, and then it becomes something else again, and you never know completely where it's going to go. And it's like anything that can become completely different from itself, and he was trying to get to that point where something completely different and completely unexpected would happen, and often what happened had a degree of horror in it, as well as humor and discovery, but there was always this turning, and I will leave it at that, and except to say that Rob's focus on process here has made it possible for me to think about that idea in a way that I couldn't have thought about before.
I'd like to thank Amanda for asking me to be here, and I know there are so many other students who also, former students and alumni who were Eyal's peers, who also could have represented his time at the school. When I began here, he had been here for a couple of years, and he was living and working in Guston's former studio, which had a lot of meaning for him, of course. and his presence was so big at the school. He had that tremendous, unmistakable laugh, and he was very warm and so passionate about so many artists. I mean, Picasso, I mean, ones who he, ended up moving on from, but there was a lot of, always a lot of energetic discussion wherever he was. And after I left the school and I got my first studio in the meatpacking district, I just answered an ad, and then Eyal had a studio across the hall suddenly. And just for you more recent New Yorkers, I mean, I thought it was, there was a guy who was a nephew of the meatpackers who was like, oh, there's all this available real estate. I thought we could do something with it. And and at the time it was like meat carcasses in the streets and sex workers, and my studio had a drain and sloped down to a drain, and but it was wonderful to share that transition time with Eyal, and he was starting his frame business then. So I had this operating idea in my mind of of his work as coming out of the legacy of the school, and I thought of his use of black as putting him in a realm with like Joyce Pensato and Christopher Wool and other people who I feel were influenced by the drawing program here, whether that's acknowledged or not. To me, it's a very rich legacy that I don't think is explored enough. And I think the drawing program that everyone in the school, whether a painter or a sculptor, drew half the day. And I think that's remarkable among, I don't know, to me, in art schools. And I think if Elena were here, I think she'd want to talk a little about Nick Caroni and his impact. And but anyway, the Eyal's recent shows and his profound talk with Michael on YouTube, which if you haven't seen, I really urge you to see, really made me rethink what I knew and understood about Eyal. I mean, to know him was to understand that he was an empath, to kind of misuse the Star Trek term. He had this deep anxiety and conscience about his Jewishness, but I sort of missed how that made the kind of work he made. I mean, he was really conscious before a lot of us began this in this horrible year. He was really conscious of a duality as victim and victimizer, and he was fearless about exploring anti-Semitic tropes. His openness let so much in, that his sensitivity, it was like he could not forget. And in his talk with Michael, he said, he talks about this restless seriality that we see, his obsessive remaking of work, and how one piece cannot sum up all that he has invested in him. One image cannot stand for him. He talked about himself as haunted and in the loneliness of the guilt he felt. And he questioned who we choose to pay attention to in the world. And I think he was able to understand in a way that most people can't, that there's a reality of two groups of people who simultaneously live in fear. So I'm hoping tonight that we can explore more about what the evolution of his work to the stripe paintings, because there was some really interesting conversation with Michael where he sort of talked about how imagery became impossible and there were limits to representation, that his work moved away from all these, the things he had explored earlier when he made these last profound stripe paintings. And now I come to see his use of black as kind of both a limit, but also a limitlessness.
That was great. So much to say. The first thing I want to say is that it's harder to see one's peers than I knew. That having this strange subtraction has made me realize that I knew Eyal in different ways for 25 years more. But only peripherally. I thought I knew his work. I'd seen, I think, most of his shows. But suddenly now I feel there's so much I didn't know, so much I hadn't connected or put together, and I was reluctant to be on the panel because I feel like I'm very much, and I know many of us are, either thinking through for the first time or rethinking in a fairly dramatic way what his work means and means to us. Among many other things, it's closer to my own than I had ever understood. I've been thinking as a watchword for myself about economy and breadth, those two kind of opposite qualities, to be able to distill something very powerfully into its simplest, most striking form, and yet not to lose the range of the world. What else? I mean, that's here. That's so powerfully here again and again. And he talked about it in the lecture that Elizabeth just mentioned, that not in exactly those terms, but very much in the same way of thinking about wanting to crystallize, distill, and at the same time to have the breadth that, for instance, photography gives us. That was something he pointed out. The photography as a kind of enormous resource and yet as an enemy is a subject that Michael brought up during his interview with Eyal that I'd love to come back to. And obscenity also, Michael's first topic, is important in all kinds of ways here. I'm thinking of a favorite image, and maybe I'll just end my remarks to begin with it. We can almost see it. It's at the bottom of that far wall, the series of tanks. They're like a little, almost like a mud pie with a long stroke to the left, right? And they're immediately recognizable, iconic, distilled. The economy I was talking about is absolutely there. They're repetitive. There's a series of them like a platoon of tanks crossing the landscape. And the way Rob has arranged this wall with the helicopters above, the tanks below, is a kind of landscape painting. But they're also obscene. And they remind me the kind of, on the one hand, the kind of flaccid tank is a little bit of a pratfall visual joke. On the other hand, it reminds me of one of the great Kathy Kollwitz drawings, which I'm sure you all know, the one where she's drawing and her hand is on the far left side of the paper, her head is on the right, and in between them is her long, skinny arm, but occupying the arm as a kind of shorthand version of the drapery of her shirt is a scribble. And the scribble takes you from the hand to the head. And the scribble is drawing. And I feel like the tank, whatever it's called, the boom, the cannon, of the tank, that is a single mark. In each drawing, it's a little different. In each drawing, it's a little bit not quite straight. Its flaccidity is partly accidental. You don't feel it's being pushed by Eyal to like, he's not digging you in the ribs about it. It's accidentalness or quasi-accidentalness kind of preserves its innocence or its tone, the feeling that it's just what happens when you draw. Your line is sometimes straight, sometimes not. All of that, to me, is tremendously immediate and beautiful in that drawing. The combination of its obscenity, its meaning, of course, in the world, what tanks do, and what drawings are. I feel like there's one in particular, I can't point it out here, but they're all kind of perfect, and there's a lot of drawings here like that, paintings and drawings, or things that are both painting and drawing, where that combination of humor, human meaning, performance, economy, breadth, are all so magically united.
Okay, assuming my voice is not very good, so maybe I won't say very much, we'll see. Excuse me. But well, one thing I could do is pull a sort of fast one and say, well, I've said it all. No, but I haven't said it all. But I did this because I had a long, intermittent relationship with Eyal, and he kept giving me energy every time I was around him, and his work kept giving me energy every time I was around it. And I just sort of thought, okay, now the circumstances attest to his slyness. Roz and I went to visit him in the hospital days before he died, and he said to me, "Would you do a show with me sometime?" And I had no idea how really sick he was. And I had no idea that we were, hours away from his disappearing entirely. And so I said, sure, and last tag, this is the result of that commitment. It's a commitment I made knowing that such a thing might happen, but not at all certain that it would. Knowing, moreover, though, that there was lots to be shown, and that many people ask me if I will do shows with him or hint at it, pressing their face against the glass. But, in this case, I had no compunctions. I was, as a curator, however, concerned with the actual doing of it, because you never know when you get into somebody's work, piles and piles and years of it, what you're going to find. And I didn't know whether there were going to be consistent tensions or limp times, slack times, and so on. And what I was stunned by was how consistent it was. There's a lot of work, and a lot of it, falls in line with things he was doing. So that it's not that if you've seen one, you've seen them at all, but if you've seen one, you can predict that there are quite a lot more. And there are. But in any case, there are things that I did not expect. There's one in particular in the show here, which is a B-52 bomber, which I saw at the apartment of the man who owns it, who's sitting right across the room. And I said, oh, that's got to be in the show. And he said, really? And I said, yeah, it does. So we managed to get that in, and it's a big painting. The rest of the work is mostly work on paper, but there's also a lot of paintings, or paintings which are paintings made out of paper palettes and so on and so forth. So the scale by itself generally tends to be small, but you can see how fully it occupies a space, regardless of the size of the actual object. Now, what can I say? Everybody's referred to it, but Eyal had a perverse sense of humor, and it was in keeping with how perverse the world actually is. And so he would make, he did me a huge solid, which was, I was floundering. I was coming out of my time at Yale. I couldn't get started in the studio. He knew that was the case. He was doing some framing for me. He'd sort of checked out the environs. And he said, listen, let me come over on Sundays, and I will sort this out. And you just sit in your chair, and I will sort it out. And it's like that commercial where somebody comes in, an older guy, says, you don't want that anymore, no. And sure enough, he did exactly that, and I didn't want those things, most of them. A few I regret, not many. So he came over for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and we would have sandwiches, sometimes brought from Brooklyn, from his part of Brooklyn to my part, other times from the neighborhood. Latterly, we had bottles of whiskey. We just improvised around doing the work that he was doing mostly, which was to ruffle through piles of paintings, piles of drawings, get rid of things, and get me squared away to start something else. Well, I am now doing something else, and it is entirely because Eyal, that's a Freudian slip. Yale was my barricade. Eyal was the person who broke through it. Anyway, but in any case, he really revived me from near-death experience. And the crack that Michael made about, a recovering critic, a recovering professor, and so on and so forth was really true. And so Eyal is part of the reason I have the recovery. Anyway, so this show was done with that all in mind, but it's not about that. It's about his work. And it's about how rich it is, how many layers of it there are, how much of it is in fact graphic, but it reads as painting or reads as painterly drawing. And so, the return of my sense of his humor was this wall over here, where you have 3 putzes and then 3 paintings of Orthodox men. I say, okay, there you go, patriarchy. And I think he would have appreciated that. some of the things that are going on in the landscape, so-called, in the back is indeed a landscape. I thought, okay, fine, we've got all this stuff flying above the heads of people, dropping bombs on them, shooting them, and then these crawling termite-like tanks. And I just said, why not just do what I've never done at the Modern or any other place, which is to treat the walls if it was a picture space, and use the pictures that Eyal made as the elements of an animated sequence. And so there's somewhat the same thing happens, the other room with the airplanes. Doing these kinds of things are in part just a response to the work, but they're in part inspired by the permission Eyal gave to think about anything and everything in his work. And so it's a kind of tribute to him that I could do this, because I've never been a straight ahead, by the book anything. But I was, after years in museums, disinclined to do these things. And then I was inspired by Eyal to try them, so I did. And I think this is one of the best installations I've ever made in any circumstance. And I hope some people who are tracking my activities, not very many do anymore, but some people will notice that actually this is not just a token show. This was actually a laboratory for thinking about working in a different way than I'd ever done, because I was dealing with an artist different than anyone I'd ever dealt with before. Now you can hear my voice disappearing. It's doing a farewell symphony, a farewell aria. So I'm going to stop now for a second and turn it back to my colleagues, and then I will re-enter as I have the voice to do it.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks to all of you. Elizabeth, you brought up the question of the stripes. I mean, you brought up a number of interesting issues, and I wonder if we want to go there. Benjamin Fiavet, who was Eyal's assistant, mentioned that the stripes really came out of the arms. So just talking about a kind of process. So he was doing the saluting, and at a certain point it simplified itself down, and it became the stripes. So just the very peculiar and interesting way in which his mind worked, and the way in which one thing had to lead to another thing, and then boom, something else happened, and it kept moving on. But I want to see where you want to go with it, and I was also interested, Alexi, where you're talking about seeing the work differently than you did when he was alive, or when you knew him, and I do feel somehow the work, it does look different now. I mean, and it certainly has something to do with Rob's installation, but it has to do with more than that. And I just wonder, if the first question goes to you, Elizabeth, then Alexi after that, what do you see that you didn't see before? You hinted at that, and what makes it possible for you to see now what you couldn't have seen then? What explains it?
Well, just to work backwards a little bit, the recent show with Elizabeth Harris, when I was looking at the stripe paintings with Amanda, I think I was coming at them with more of a landscape lens, almost looking at the moments when there was sort of radiance behind the stripes, and we had talked about how he felt he had this big breakthrough and he was eager to keep working. And I just really didn't see the stripes as kind of a negation of previous imagery. And I'm wondering about, maybe Rob can answer, those Gustin drawings where he, just started paring everything down and said, okay, I'm just going to make these lines, and then it grew and grew. I feel like that seems to be what you're saying, that he moved from these iterations of the salute and to a line, and then a place that I guess he talked to you about how he felt that the imagery was no longer as meaningful as abstraction, right? I think.
But he talked about the stripes. They were still surrogates. That's the word he used. They were still surrogates for the figure, and he was still, even if he was stripping it down. He was looking. I think he used the word inexhaustible for. So he found in the stripes the more and more. even though it was becoming, less and less in terms of stripped down form. And that whole world of the stripes to him, I mean, he talked about it as being one of amazement for him, that they could just keep, they could keep going and going, and certainly it belonged to different kinds of traditions. And, Rob mentioned in his essay, what he did with the stripes, though, is very different, and the kind of pressure on them and the way that they're opening up and et cetera. So it was this enormous discovery and breakthrough, and he was going and going and going with them, and who knows how far he would have gone. But it was some kind of spectacular. I mean, we see the work differently because those works exist than if we wouldn't. It really was a spectacular kind of breakthrough, but it also emerged quite logically out of the form language that was going on in the salutes.
I don't buy that. That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, just more fun to have a little disagreement. I think Eyal reached for stuff that he wanted, and you see him. I mean, that's back to the question of breadth. That he's, there are all kinds of predecessors, and I think that's what changed for me is that, and part of it has to do with the pettiness of your peers. You're another painter, you're looking at somebody's work, you're almost hoping that their work is derivative. We all see we're in this belated culture, we're aware of sources. Eyal was a hugely knowing painter, and one of the surprises for me is how much he and it really was so powerfully present above all in the Stripe show. How much he got past, was able to individuate all the ghosts in the room, or Christopher Wool, or all kinds of Kara Walker, the people you could look at them skeptically and see those models, ghosts, other figures. When I saw the stripe paintings, I had to let go of my any kind of little territorial feeling of like, there's a lot of stripe paintings in the world, because they looked just weirdly fresh. They looked, Rob, you described them as something like the charcoal grill of history or something. But that seems right. They have this kind of like burnt, gristly, slightly grotesque, specific material look that isn't like other stripe paintings. And how could that be? We've had so many fucking stripe paintings, but his opened a new page.
So where do you think how do you see them in relation to the previous work? Like, you see them as coming out of the previous work as being completely different from the work? Like, what is the relationship from what came before?
I would love to know his work. There's a period I don't really know. He talked about this in your interview, the period of avoidance before 2001. And I'd love, that's not in this show, right, Rob? And the studio school I think of as a kind of insider-outsider as being a castle of formalism, basically. And I love formalism, I'm sure Eyal did, but I see the stripe paintings as a renegotiation with formalism, coming back home in some ways to the elemental formalist motif, the grid.
But the bastion of formalism, like where if we talk about Guston and Giacometti and de Kooning, how do they fit that language?
Well, it's always been a tension, and it's a sophisticated school, so of course they weren't exiled. But I felt like there's formalism in Guston, adjusting the blues to the reds, all of that was always there. I don't know. I'm throwing this out. Again, I feel like I'm starting to think about this work more thoroughly. I'm curious to know this audience is full of people who knew him and studied at the school, and I feel like we have an incredible brain trust here in this room.
I would just venture again, I don't know if my voice will hold up, but I would just venture that all of us who make things have unanswered or unattended to business. And that as Eyal approached the end of his life, and he must have intuitively known that was happening, he was trying to face it and face those unfinished pieces of business. So if you are the product of a figurative tradition if you are deeply knowledgeable about abstract art that is not figurative at all. What do you do with that knowledge? How do you find a way to deal with it? And I think what Eyal was doing with the stripe paintings was both testing mark making and surfacing and so on and so forth, but he's also testing the symbolic value of certain things so that he was conscious of Stella's black paintings. He was conscious of the fact that concentration camp uniforms had stripes. He was conscious of many things like that. And what he did not do was to try to synthesize it or create a cute equation that made it all work out. He just faced it as a series of opportunities and problems and then made vigorous work about that.
How do you then, if you talk about the unfinished business then with his work, and you mentioned Auschwitz, I mean, just to sort of move toward the content of the work in a way, this very strong feelings he had about Israel, and what he talked about in the interview, his own history coming out of the Holocaust, the sense of victims in his family, and at the same time, being part of a country that was victimizing, and the need to address, very specific imagery, the helicopters, the tanks, the Fagin imagery, these photographs of Auschwitz. So I guess I'm just asking, I can understand the unfinished business in a way in terms of artistic questions, even formal questions, but I'm asking about how that works in terms of the content that he was so obsessively trying to deal with.
Let me just say, this is actually, I have a partner exhibition that's currently at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and it's photographs by a guy named Tomer Ganehar, who was in my Biennale, and who started to take an interest in Philip Johnson, and asked me to get him into the Glass House, and then, because of his family connections, found his way into the Sorek reactor, which was built by Philip. And the fact that Israel should invite Philip at all is stunning, given that Philip was the worst kind of fascist, a furtive, secretive, but deeply racist fascist. And, so I think Eyal was looking at people like that, and I think Guston was, again, a key factor in that. People of deep ambivalence, people who are attracted to the evil side of things, or attracted to people who are attracted to the evil side and trying to figure it out through his art. And I think it was an attempt on his part to cathartically enact and perform and concretize a sympathy for the devil or a fascination with the devil. And I think it's generational too, because Tomer is roughly the same generation. And I think there are a lot of Israeli and a lot of American Jews and a lot of American Gentiles who grew up in environments where these were living things, and just they haven't been able to figure it out. And so they do, or they try.
Can I just add that one of the most obvious striking features of Eyal in person was the kind of malice and warmth in his laugh, right? It was mischievous doesn't really do it justice. It was like there was the evil that you mentioned was kind of there, and warmth right away, both together.
It makes me think of Noam's, presentation in the memorial when he talked about what they would laugh at, and yeah. I mean, there were kind of no limits to what you would laugh at, and there was a bigness about that. That's what maybe I think we're trying to get at the work too, like a bigness in this, and what we're looking at, and what constitutes that, and what that actually means.
And I think it's one of the reasons that the rules about what cannot be said and should not be said just can't be enacted. Anything's fair game. You know if somebody is saying it with malice, and then you shun them. But if it's not being said with malice, and then they are cathartic. And I think Kara Walker is an example of that. There are a lot of artists who have done the thing they were not supposed to do, but with such verve, such energy, and such, basically contempt for people who really believe that shit. but sympathy for people who are kind of curious about it, and where does it come from, and what does it touch?
I wonder what, if we talk, and then I'd like to open it up, but if we talk about the images behind us, like what you think of them and what you think his relationship was to this the Heil Hitler salute, you know. And I mean, he said he wanted to make 6 million of them, and you know, even stating that is like a work of art in itself. It sort of forever frames the way in which we see the series. But you know, just what it was like to go back to this, like day after day after day, sort of week after week, and immerse himself in this particular gesture. And he had people model for him as well. But I wonder, like, just about the accumulative effect, because we're sitting here and it's like a decor behind us, and then we're immersed in these, you know, dozens or more of images. And I sort of asked myself what it was like for him to do this, like, day after day after day, and it was endless. So there was like kind of, I mean, this of all the series is the one that communicates most overtly this endlessness that he was involved in, of a process without end, and a process where he was going to take on, you know, what Rob said, which is really difficult subject matter and images that maybe a lot of other people weren't going to go to, and he was going to do it, and he was going to do it again and again and again and again.
I hadn't realized that they were on, so many of them were on calendar pages. That this sort of like an encoiara of Hitler salute.
I mean, I don't have much to add, except I think if you've been deeply traumatized by something, which the war did to everybody who grew up in its aftermath, or did in fear of its repeating itself, or in the case of Eyal, the wars in Israel of which he was ashamed. You know, I think if you really are traumatized, then you don't come to the end of it, you don't solve it, but you do relive it, and if you can relive it in different registers, including humor, that is a kind of a solace or a relief. And I think what he was doing was he was laughing his way through the Holocaust. I mean, it was just, and Roberto Benigno did not do that.
But was this piece the kind of pivot? I mean, was this piece the permission slip, the kind of giant opening door project?
I can't answer that, but there are numbers of versions of this, so this is not the only version of it. There were other versions of this wall that were in the studio, and you know, I think this was predicated on drawings that are around the corner, which are direct responses to Anselm Kiefer's Occupation series, and that was a series that shocked a lot of people. I remember very vividly when it came out, and I was at that time working for as a corporate art handler for a woman who herself was a Holocaust survivor, and she was interested in it, and she collected Kiefer's for the corporation. So, you know, I think it just touched raw nerves, and that people realized that they were raw, but not that they were tolerably raw, and that therefore it allowed them to think about what made them so.
I think, Alexi, I think of the stripes maybe is a little bit more that way, because he did them vertically and he did them horizontally, and so he did them in a way that connected with the concentration camps, and he did them in a way that connected with the chain gangs here, and you know, making some kind of analogy even between like different forms of horrific history that were, and he made them with, you know, on rags too. So that feels to me like even more visceral in the way in which he was immersing himself in, or taking on, you know, a kind of complexity of history that therefore he could go with and do more with than, I mean, my sense than what he could do with this. I think those stripes were more important.
There's one over in the whatever entryway that's especially clearly a rag, and you hung it in kind of quasi-isolation, Rob, so that we can really see that. Yeah.
I did that partly just because I was at a loss of space. Let's be honest, right? Curators do cut corners. But the other thing is that he was very much interested in the fabric and the uniforms in the camps, and the slippage between the two of them. And he was interested in striped dish towels as sort of the middle term, but there are none of them here. But I mean, that is... It's like when you think something and you don't give it an image, you think it, you feel it, but you don't give it an image, and then somebody gives it an image, then things come to bear.
Okay, so we'd love to hear from you. Are there any questions? Yeah.
It's a great show, and it's great to see this installation here. And like you're saying, Rob, there's so many. Well, you're all saying that the work is so rich, and there's so much going on. And I knew Eyal from the time I'd go by his frame shop on Sullivan Street, and just looked at his work, and always thought it was amazing. And I recommended him to Elizabeth Harris, and she took him on. And I thought, wow, that's good for Elizabeth Harris. I didn't expect it. So I would continue to go into that shop and talk to him about things and whatnot. But, that's just a personal history. There's so many interesting questions that you could get into on this format, and I don't want to take up too much time, but just to say that someone I painted with at the studio school, we shared a studio in the basement. This is with Laura Lehrman, and she said if I'd figured out how to paint the way Eyal did, I might not be a lawyer. I'd still be painting. And she's a lawyer for the Brandeis Center, which is, some of you may know, a pretty intense operation. But one of the things I could compare is this installation to Christopher Wool's installation at 101 Greenwich Street, and it is really interesting for me just to think about the different things that are going on in Eyal's work versus Christopher Wool's. But the question to the panelists that I'd like to ask is, how would you compare Eyal's work to Leon Golub in the sense of, there's a lot of similarities and there are a lot of differences, and I thought that's an excellent kind of comparison to make that draw out the richness of both projects.
Rob, it seems to be the logical one for you to take on.
That's a tough one because that's a tough one because I knew Leon very well, and I don't see a sensibility connection, even though there's certain problematics that do overlap. But Leon was a kind of more declarative guy for all that, and he had irony, he had ambivalence, he had all the things that Eyal had, but he also wanted to make a big statement, and in a big way, and he was competing for big position in the art world at all times. And Eyal was not competing. Eyal was just making his shit and putting it out there. And I think that's to be admired. That's one of the reasons I admire him. He did not have an obvious ambition, but he was very ambitious for the work. And so I think that the trade-offs that are involved in that, if you're a practitioner, are very considerable, but I think he made the right choice. And in the aggregate, I think the work speaks to the fact that he did.
Yeah, I guess I as you say that, I think to myself that Golub was a kind of 50s painter, mural-sized, and Eyal in some ways was a kind of 90s painter, a kind of painter formed, even though this work was all made after in this century. It seems to me it still responds to the kind of contraction and ambitious modesty of 90s painting.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add. The history paintings, the scale, I don't know if this is like the equivalent of Leon's history painting, and the particular very physical way that Leon was involved in the process of the painting, of the applying and the scraping and everything else, so that the way in which he made the painting was a way in which the ambivalence could express itself, and in which he could actually enter into some of the violence and aggression of the material that he was handling. So I don't, those paintings took a long time to make, and the question of how Eyal like involved himself in the paintings, and because he made so many more, and it was so much about a kind of series and sequence. Like, did he get to something similar by doing one after another that Leon made by doing one single thing? I don't know, but I think in some ways they were both trying to enter the complexity and the ambivalence of what they were talking about and make a statement that was moral without being moralistic.
One more obvious thing is just that Eyal's work was so much more interested in economy or being iconic or being one thing so often. I mean, so many of these images, one word, one helicopter, one head, one body, it's not always true, but clearly it was a huge drive in his work to have a kind of the viewers confronting some singleness right there with the kind of immediacy of that one-to-one relationship. That runs through all this work, and he again spoke about it beautifully in your interview. It was one of the drivers of the seriality as well. Because the images were lean, were iconic, they could kind of flock together.
You know, when Michael asked him, like, you know, why do you work so small? And he made some statement that I didn't really buy about, you know, like, oh, well, it's about time and stuff. Because immediately I thought of, sorry, I'm forgetting the name. Who's the artist who did the rose? You know, the woman who, yeah. I was like, well, he could have been doing one big monumental thing a day at a time. But he, you know, chose to do the small series and push the image over and over. Like one would not suffice.
I just wonder, is it maybe, you know, I think there was a kind of imperial image, like a kind of imperialism that horrified him, and I think that the idea of the singularity of the total kind of encompassing image almost goes against the nature of the politics as well as the nature of the way he worked.
I just wanted to circle back to your comment because I mean, I knew Eyal and I've known his work, but I feel like it's such a revelation to see this show. And I have been staring at this wall, as we all have, and I'm so struck. For me, before you said Leon Golub, I thought Nancy Sparrow. And I never would have made that connection in a million years between Eyal and Nancy Sparrow's work. And maybe it is the intimacy and the seriality and the iconic nature of her work that, to me, yeah, so it's just sort of interesting, a husband-wife connection there. Yeah.
You know, what I'm trying to get at is the content, and Leon Golub is dealing with mercenaries and the Contras, and he's really into the politics, and he's aggressively pushing against, you know, being a very unpopular person in a political sense. And he's doing things that I think a lot of artists would never be able to take on and feel good about. And similarly, Eyal is taking on, in a political sense, imagery which makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and he's pushing against, you know, common political themes. So I just find the two of them jumping into the political content world and making compelling work, and how unusual that is. And you don't see that pulled off very, very often, and it's really kind of unique. And you know, I could go on with other things, but it's the content that really I think they share.
Any other questions for our panelists? Yes.
I'm just thinking about the difference between some of this work and the stripe paintings that you guys were talking about. And my own impression is that those stripe paintings are so completely visceral that the emotion in those paintings, or that he was, something he was feeling when he was making those paintings, make them really stand out in terms of their intensity. I mean, we can be horrified by the Nazi salute, but when you look at the stripe paintings, there's something else happening there. So I wonder if you wanted to talk about how you feel about the difference between depiction and then the kind of embodiment of a feeling.
I would just add that I think Eyal had a thorough knowledge of modern art history, and he was engaged in it in his sleep, in his waking hours. He went to shows. He imbibed more and more and more of it. He was never done with it. And I think that those late paintings are his response to that in large part. I went with him, I don't know, maybe it was a month or 2 months before he died, to see the show that was at the Met of Cubism and trompe-l'oeil, which was a crazy show. I mean, it was not a well-considered show, but it has some very wonderful things in it. And that's my curatorial side. But anyway, and he was just absolutely enthralled. And in particular, the paintings that are in the other room, these ovals that he made, are a direct product of that, his re-engagement with early Cubism and early Cubist formats. So I think that he was always doing that at the same time. And if you think about it, we live in a world where we're obliged to. If we're going to think about formalism at all, we have to also think about the context in which it happens. If we're thinking in the context in which it happens too much, we can't function, at which point abstraction, involvement with pure form or impure form, if you will, is a lifesaver. You know, it's the way, it's the sort of oscillations of our lives, in fact.
That's fun to know. I mean, of course, it immediately makes sense that those, and I'm thinking especially of the oval drawings, which are not in this show, but were in the last show at Elizabeth Harris, which are kind of like a accelerated Cubist still life, yeah.
Elisa, I just wondered, like, when you look at those stripe paintings and you think, because you were at the school with him, right? Whether you see those paintings coming out of the school at all? Or how do you see them in relation to what was happening at the school?
Well, he was such a physical artist, and he was very intense when he was. Elizabeth will remember when he was in the drawing room. It was very intense. He was just ferocious, and his approach and kind of focus, and I feel that in those stripe paintings, very much so.
More than in the making than in the actual imagery.
I think that the imagery and the making in those paintings, for me, comes together beautifully in a way that, like the tank, I mean, the tanks and they're beautiful, the helicopters, they're frightening, but there's something like a howl in those stripe paintings. It's very, for me, very different.
I have an online question. It's sort of two parts, but they're very related. They're mostly for you, Rob. This person writes, I would love to hear Rob talk a bit about the process by which he chose and hung the work. And she also wonders if you see the show as being in dialogue with Eyal. And if so, could you share some of what that looked like or felt like?
Well, first of all, it was very much in dialogue with Eyal. He dealt the cards, so to speak, and then I sorted it out into suits and runs and whatever hands. No, thanks to Amanda, I'm having every kind of old age problem you can think of. That was one of them. Okay, thanks to Amanda and to Ben, and hours that we spent looking at things online and then in the studio, I was able to look at as much as I could possibly want, and could make temporary decisions. And then when I got to the point where I realized I'd saved too much, I could override my own temporary decision without too much grumbling, or in fact with no grumbling whatsoever. Because for me, the process of making an exhibition is always a process. It's always something you do in direct dialogue with the work. I never know how a wall's going to look before I do it. And the people who I worked with here were very generous about rehanging and rephrasing things, because you just don't know what you're dealing with when you're looking at images on a screen. You don't know what you're dealing with when you have not seen these things thrown together in sort of kind of chance would have it kind of situations. So I have always worked this way to the extent that the institutions I've worked with allowed. Some of them allow it more grudgingly than others, but I tend to insist on it now, just flat out insist this is going to be something I won't know what these rooms are going to look like. I'm not going to map it on a computer or even on a floor plan. I will use a floor plan like a rehearsal space. And I'll say, well, I now know from this floor plan that I can get this stuff in the room together. After that, where they land, you just, and, I've had art handlers who said, well, what's the perfect height? 57 inches? And these are all going to go like this, aren't they? And I just have to be patiently disabusing them of that fact, because I want to hang everything, and I want to hang it within inches or centimeters of where it ultimately ends up. And you can't program that. You can't use computers. You can't explain it to people who don't see the things, same things you do. And it's an inefficient way, but efficiency is not on the side of art. So.
Thank you, Rob. Do we have a final question for our panelists?
I feel like asking just a quick question, which would be like Eyal's. Rob, how about recurating this at the Drawing Center next year?
If we have a country next year, the answer is yes.
Lots more to look forward to. Well, thank you all so much for this program.
Thank you.